Hello and welcome. This is video number 8 in a 9-part series about the post-World War II world. In this video, the focus will be on the end of the Soviet Union, giving particular attention to the role that Mikhail Gorbachev played in the mid to late 1980s. So let's get started. All right, so the first part of what I want to talk about with this final lesson is the decline of the Soviet Union and the role that Mikhail Gorbachev had in that coming about. And though you might see that or think of decline of the Soviet Union being a negative thing or some kind of a failure, certainly from the American perspective, the changes that would start to take place and the change that would come from Gorbachev's time as a leader in the Soviet Union was definitely viewed favorably from our perspective. Now, we didn't talk a whole lot about big events from the 60s, 70s, and getting into the 80s, but one thing that seemed like it was going to be permanent was communism in the Soviet Union, communism in Eastern Europe, that's just the way it was, and that's all there was to it. It was hard to imagine that things would be different, and especially getting into the 1960s, both sides, the side of the Soviet Union, the side of the United States, had pretty well settled into our perspectives and our positions on different issues, and that's just where we were. Specifically looking at the Soviet Union, a big part of why it looked like it was set up in a very particular way and was just going to stay that way forever was the Politburo. The Politburo was the ruling committee of the Communist Party. So if you look at the hierarchy of power in the Soviet Union, at the very top, as far as a group, would be the Politburo. Then there would be the Communist Party. Then there would be everybody else. Not very many people fit into the Communist Party. Even fewer people were a part of the Politburo. So those that were a part of the Politburo were in control and in charge of virtually everything that was going to happen with the Soviet Union. And one of the things that became true in that environment, especially going back to the days of Stalin and moving forward, is that you just simply didn't express dissent or disagreement with what the government was doing and what the government was about. And so things just kind of happened in the Soviet Union the way the Politburo wanted it to happen, whether it was to anyone's benefit or not. Now, moving ahead, getting to the 1980s, things had kind of been as they had been, kind of decade after decade, 60s, 70s, getting into the 80s. And again, people figured as things have been going, they would just simply continue to go. The top position in the Soviet Union was the general secretary position, and it was not set up like our presidency where a person gets elected, they have a certain term they serve, and then move on. When people got into that position, they were sort of in there for an indefinite period of time. Death would likely be the kind of thing that might take somebody out of that position. Stalin had held the position for several decades. There hadn't been an awful lot of leaders in that position getting to this point, but that would start to change, and that would actually create an opportunity for things really to actually change in the Soviet Union. So if you looked at where the Soviet Union was at getting into the 80s, Brezhnev was the general secretary that took the Soviet Union into the 80s. He would die. He would be replaced by another person, Andropov. He would die. He would get replaced by another person, Chernenko. He would die. So in the course of just a few years, the Soviet Union went through 3 different general secretaries. And one of the things that was challenging with that is just from, say, the U.S. perspective and a relationship with the Soviet Union, it was difficult for our president at the time, Ronald Reagan, to establish much of a rapport with these leaders. And any of the efforts to try to improve relations or just figure each other out or whatever were made quite a bit more difficult by the fact that their top position kept changing almost year after year after year. Now, because they ended up having a number of general secretaries die in quick succession, that would actually have an impact on who they selected to replace Chernenko. So the Politburo, who ultimately was in charge of deciding who this person was going to be, made the decision in 1985 to choose Mikhail Gorbachev to be the new general secretary. Now, understand, if you see that he's 54 years old, and it talks about him being young and energetic, and that was something that they were drawn to, might not feel like somebody 54 years old is particularly young, but when you consider all the general secretaries that the Soviet Union had ever had, Only Stalin was actually younger than Gorbachev when taking over that position. So it was a position held by much older people most of the time. So again, relatively speaking, Gorbachev was viewed as young and energetic, and apparently the Politburo thought this was going to be good for the Soviet Union. I don't know that the Politburo really understood what they were getting. It's hard to imagine with where things will go that had the Politburo known that, they would have gone with this choice. Again, from the U.S. perspective, there was an awful lot to like about this guy. So just going through very briefly some of the reforms or changes that Gorbachev brought to the Soviet Union that would result in massive change. We'll start first with glasnost. Glasnost, if you want to translate that out, means openness. And this was meant to address the realities of the Soviet Union being a totalitarian state going back to the days of Stalin. What that meant for the people is anybody that had an idea kept it to themselves. People were afraid to say something that would sound like opposition. And one of the things that Gorbachev recognized is that not a lot of new things were happening in the Soviet Union, that it was easy for it to fall behind and be behind because they didn't have a whole lot of people providing input into new ways to make things better. So a challenge for the Soviet Union was, and for Gorbachev, was to get people to share ideas. Because keep in mind, people had grown up in an environment where that was dangerous. And so in order to show people that he was serious about opening things up a bit in Soviet society, he did a number of things. They're listed here. Open churches. It's typical in communist societies to not allow for religion. Typically, leaders and the government want everyone's focus and attention to be on them. But there were many spiritual people in the Soviet Union, what was largely Russia, and so this was well received to have religious institutions allowed to operate again. Political prisoners were released. This basically means people who had been put in jail because they had spoken out against the government, not murderers or people like that, but just people who had ideas. So they were released to show that they were serious. Banned books was a thing. Books that had been not allowed started to be allowed. And the press started to be allowed to operate more freely than had been true in possibly ever in this place. And all of that was to show people that Gorbachev was serious. He wanted to hear what the people thought about things. He wanted to know about their ideas. Another area that was really important to address was the economy. Central planning and a command economy was what the Soviet Union had been for decades. And one of the things that had led to was horrible inefficiency and a real lack of incentive for anybody to be creative, for anybody to work hard. So what they got was a whole lot of mediocre to nothing out of their economy. And Gorbachev recognized that this wasn't good. Now, he wasn't advocating that communism be scrapped, but he did suggest that there could be some tweaks and some changes that could make it better. This was a part of an idea of his called Perestroika. So if you translate that out, it essentially means economic restructuring. So basically what he was going to try to do in the Soviet Union was make efficient communism. One of the big problems was, basically the Politburo, or those few people at the top, made all the economic decisions. They said what people could be paid. They said how much people needed to make, how much should be produced, everything. And so there was no local level decision making going on. There was no way to benefit from doing better. And so he wanted to put a little bit more opportunity into the hands of people at the local level to make some of their own choices and to give some people some opportunity to benefit from doing well or doing more. And so this was a step forward to get the economy moving a little bit better in the Soviet Union. Another area that he wanted to address was something called democratization, basically opening up the political system a little bit and making it a little more democratic. Even though in the Soviet Union they held elections all through the years, the reality was that essentially the Politburo would predetermine who was going to be in elected positions, and people essentially had the opportunity to approve those picks without an opportunity to not approve those picks. And Gorbachev wanted to actually have real elections. And one of the things you saw as elections started to take place for real is that reform-minded candidates were winning the elections. The people who typically had held positions of power were not being chosen by the Soviet people at this point in time. And I know my image is in front of the translation of the picture up here, but that was just basically a political poster that said "All for the elections." Okay, and then one last area that would prove very big, especially as it related to the United States, was with foreign policy. The Soviet Union was in an arms race with the United States right now. And compared to the Soviet Union, we basically had an unlimited amount of money to spend building up our military. And the Soviet Union had been trying to keep pace with us over the years. And they basically were practically bankrupt as a country. They just could not afford to match what we had. And he recognized this. And so the direction he chose to go with that was to try to engage more diplomatically with the United States and actually work to reduce or limit the arms production and the arms race. And so one of the big things that came from this was the beginning of a series of arms reduction treaties, where we actually started to get rid of things like nuclear weapons, not completely or anything like that, but started to get just to lessen what we had. So that was a big step forward to better relations between our two countries, and also what began to feel like a more safe environment between our two countries and around the world. Now, one other thing I want to just insert in here before we wrap this one up is that not only did he work on making some changes in the Soviet Union, but he really wanted to lessen the grip the Soviet Union had on, in particular, the Eastern European countries than they had had for a long time. And so basically, with Gorbachev in power, he told Eastern European countries, you know what, you're free to do things as you want to do things. If you want to be communist, be communist. If you want to go a different direction, it's up to you now. We're no longer going to tell you what to do. Well, thanks for watching that video. Hopefully you have a better understanding of how the relations between the United States and Soviet Union improved during the time that Gorbachev was in power. Thanks for watching.